Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for attending today's event. As Patrick said, my name is Eva Jansen, and I'm a doctoral student here at the Faculty of Information. I'd like to thank Patrick for sharing this opportunity to support and participate in the iSchool's colloquia series this year. Today, I have the very great pleasure of introducing to you someone with whom many of you are well acquainted both personally and professionally. I, however, do not fall into that category, so I'm going to tell you how it is I came to know about our esteemed guests' contributions to the vast and diverse fields we are calling information. Prior to pursuing graduate studies, I had been working for some time with clinical research scientists, performing data entry and various administrative work, and including a lot of time spent in front of a photocopier. I was an unconfessed list worker with an interest in database management and programming and graphic design. And through an online community called the Computer Professionals for Social Responsibility, I discovered the existence of the participatory design movement. It was a notion that held great power for me as I considered leaving work and pursuing graduate studies. So to explore further, I attended the PDC conference in 2004 here in Toronto. And as luck would have it, I had the pleasure of listening to our guest as I have here graciously accepted, but actually I checked the facts, and she was graciously giving out an award. So, as an outsider, I was very encouraged to learn that there were people who were interested in learning about and uncovering the kind of work that often goes unnoticed in the fabric of everyday organizational and technological practices. So like many others, I was astounded by Dr. Suchman's insights and inspired by the approach to research that she undertook to produce them. So this work she has called, and I quote, a long-standing critical engagement with the project of making machines more like humans. Lucy Suchman's anthropological studies at the Xerox Palo Alto Research Center in the 1980s resulted in creating an awareness of the role of context in human cognition. She is also credited with developing the methodology of ethnographically based design. Her anthropological insight and her feminist theoretical sensibilities combine not only an adaptability to study people, but also to question yourself in the social context from which we build knowledge. Her critique of the conventional view of human-machine interaction continues to make an impact on the thinking of researchers, designers, and practitioners from fields of cognitive science, computer science, engineering, psychology, anthropology, design, and the information disciplines. She has changed the way we view human problem solving. She's changed the way we define information systems, and she's changed the way we make human-machine interfaces. Her ongoing work is concerned with how humans are described and imagined in light of machines that imitate humans, and the work of researchers who design such machines. She continues to inspire us with new analytic perspectives leading to new kinds of relationships to describe. For instance, her feminist critique of humanoid robots featured in demonstrations is exemplary of her ongoing, and I quote again, work against the digital naturalization of conventional visions of life, and for a greater sense of possibility in relations of becoming for humans and machines. Lucy Suchman is Professor of Anthropology of Science and Technology in the Department of Sociology at Lancaster University, co-director of Lancaster's Center for Science Studies. And before taking up her present post, she was a principal scientist at Xerox Palo Alto's Research Center, where she spent 20 years as a researcher and a founding member and manager of the work practice and technology area. Her research has included ethnographic studies of everyday practices of technology and design and use, critical engagement with projects in the design of human-like machines, and interdisciplinary and participatory interventions in new technology design. In 2002, she received the Benjamin Franklin Medal in Computer and Cognitive Sciences, and in 2010, the Association for Computing Machinery's SIG CHI Lifetime Research Award. She is the author of Human-Machine Reconfigurations, published by Cambridge in 2007. And so, these many years after my first encounter with her brilliant, inspiring, and emancipatory work, I consider it a very great honor indeed to stand up here and welcome her as a guest to iSchool. Steve,
What a lovely introduction. Thank you for that. And thanks to Patrick for the very ambitious project of organizing this series, running practically weekly, which is an amazing amount of work, and very much appreciated, and I'm really delighted to be here. So those of you who've been tracking the announcements for today's talk will know that the title has been a bit unstable. So let me begin by clarifying what I'll be talking about today and how it tracks into the workshop tomorrow, which is titled Figuring the Human in Technologies of Virtuous War. What I'll do today is to sketch out the broader frame of theoretical and methodological commitments that informs my studies at the interface of the digital and other materialities, inspired by feminist science and technology studies. And then I'll end today with an introduction to my current project on developments in contemporary warfighting, which we'll then explore further in tomorrow's workshop. So this image, which I'll come back to, operates in the context of my title as a kind of visual pun, get it? But also as an indication of the kinds of relations that I'm interested in. So entanglements of persons, there is a person off outside the frame, bodies, the one attached to this hand and the hand, devices, it's difficult to see, but she's actually holding a pen with which she's highlighting an aspect of the computer-aided design rendering that she's describing. Techniques, discourses, and material practices, both inside and outside the frame. And so what I've given you is a particular screen capture from a video, which itself had already framed what it was that we were looking at. And that question of framing and what is included and excluded is going to be a kind of recurring theme as we go along. So I use the word entanglements. So let me start with what feminist theorist Karen Barad says about entanglement. So she says, quote, "To be entangled is not simply to be intertwined with another, as in the joining of separate entities, but to lack an independent, self-contained existence. Existence is not an individual affair. Individuals do not pre-exist their interactions. Rather, individuals emerge through and as part of their entangled intra-relating." So this is a kind of slightly mind-bending conceptual frame that we're going to start with. And this quote comes from this book, Meeting the Universe Halfway, Karen Barad's book published in 2007. And in it, Barad develops this kind of inversion of the causality of entities in which individuals are effects of rather than prior to their relations. And she at once works with and expands conceptual frames that are drawn from theoretical physics. Karen Barad was a tenured professor of theoretical physics before she took up her current position as professor of feminist studies, philosophy, and history of consciousness at the University of California at Santa Cruz. So she's bringing together theoretical physics, post-structuralist social theory, feminist theory, and science and technology studies to develop these ideas. So the book elaborates a series of commitments and associated ideas. First of all, the inseparability of meaning and matter, the inseparability of the conceptual or the discursive and the material. The question of how we might understand the capacities or the agencies of both humans and non-humans as an effect of their relations. This is sometimes shorthanded as the more than human, particularly in relation to, in relation to both humans and non-human animals, to the environment, both the built and the natural environment. How is it that it's in our relations with those things that our capacities for action emerge? And then given this kind of relational starting place, how to trace what she calls agential cuts, or the effects of the boundary work through which entities are constituted, including the inevitable exclusions that those cuts enact. So she's arguing that entities, individualization, is an effect of particular kinds of cuts in relations, and those are things that we ourselves are implicated in. And so one corollary of that is taking seriously the premise that the scientist is part of the world that she observes. So as Barad argues, we're not outside of the world, nor are we in the world. We are, as she says, part of the world's becoming. And one of my favorite quotes from her is this one: "Agency is not an attribute, but the ongoing reconfigurings of the world." So I've worked with this idea of reconfigurings myself, most directly in thinking about relations between humans and artifacts, starting with my book, Human-Machine Reconfigurations. And this is the cover image from the book. It's from a 13th century manuscript of automata that were designed, or at least imagined, it's not clear how many of these were actually realized, by the Arab scholar al-Jazari. So this is a book of 50 different automata. And this particular automaton is titled "A Device for Washing Hands." And so we have this device that configures a bird, a little human figure, what are obviously kind of built objects, into a mechanism. This is clearly something that's been built, but where it's difficult to tell actually what's natural, what's artificial, who's doing what exactly in the service of whom. And so I like this figure because it's obviously a machine of some kind, but it's very ambiguous in its configuration in terms of what are the distributions between the humans and the non-humans, and those are the questions that I explore in the book. And my touchstone in the book is this trope of reconfiguration, and at the center of that, kind of literally, is the figure. And Donna Haraway's argument that all language, including the most technical language, the most mathematical language, is figural. That is, it's metaphorical. It's made up of tropes or of turns of phrase that invoke different associations across diverse realms of meaning and practice. And so following that, Haraway proposes that we might think about technologies as forms of materialized figuration. That is, they're arrangements that affect particular meaningful associations between persons and things. And so given that, one question we might ask is, how are relations of humans and machines figured together? First of all, how are humans and machines respectively figured? How are they figured together or configured in contemporary discourses and practices of technology? And how might they be reconfigured or figured differently and figured together differently? And of course, reconfiguration plays as well on that term's kind of currency in everyday language of systems development, where reconfiguration means kind of rearranging the relations and connections between things. And throughout all of this, my interest is always following Barad and other feminist theorists in this relation between cultural imaginaries, that is the kind of collective resources we have to think about the world, and material practices. How are those things joined together? So much of my work, as Eva mentioned in the book and subsequently, has been focused more specifically on machines that are created in the image of the human, so humanoid machines, and particularly humanoid robots. And in this paper, Subject Objects, that was published in the journal Feminist Theory, I read a short video posted on YouTube that's documenting an encounter between some humans and the sociable robot Mertz during a one-week period when Mertz the robot was installed in the public area of the lobby of the Stata Center at MIT. That's the building that houses the departments of computer science and artificial intelligence. So Mertz was set up in the lobby with the idea that the robot would kind of elicit interactions from people passing by. And this particular group of people, as many people these days do, documented their encounter with Mertz and posted it. And I love this encounter because unlike most demos, which are very carefully constrained and framed and set up to show off certain aspects of the robot, this one was much more impromptu and kind of cinema verite kind of documentation. And so in the paper, I kind of play with the contrast between the researcher's interest, which was in Mertz's ability to engage in functions like the accurate recognition of human faces, the mapping of the words that were said to it, and my own reading of this encounter, which looked at the kind of entangled boundaries of subjects and objects that it seemed to me it so vividly demonstrated. So I try to track the moment-to-moment shifting kind of choreography of this very lively object and its obliging subjects, because they were doing everything they could to try to be successful interlocutors. I look at the way in which over the course of the encounter, the humans alternately shape themselves into, on the one hand, kind of appropriately cartoon subjects in order to engage with the robot in the ways that it needs them to, and then reframe the robot as an object of their kind of shared puzzlement and pleasure. Mertz, meanwhile, is robotically translating the fragments of sound and motion that these noisy objects are emitting into readable signals and enacting its own inbuilt logic of more and less sensible replies. So I suggest that as they're entrained by Mertz's vitality, the humans are robotically subjectified, while when they shift their orientation to each other's queries and laughter, the robot is correspondingly restored to human-like objectness. The interactivity of persons and things is manifest here as moments of bodily imitation and connection that are animated by affective dynamics that escape their classification and don't show up in any of the graphs produced in the research papers. And these, I suggest, are what Donna Haraway would identify as the experiment's immeasurable results, as she puts it. And most recently, I've had the pleasure of collaborating with Claudia Castaneda on a paper that's going to appear soon in the journal Social Studies of Science, titled Robot Visions. The paper is inspired by this epigraph from Donna Haraway's classic work, Primate Visions. So Haraway writes, quote, "Children, AI computer programs, and non-human primates all here embody almost minds. Who or what has fully human status? What is the end or telos of this discourse of approximation, reproduction, and communication, in which the boundaries among and within machines, animals, and humans are exceedingly permeable? Where will this evolutionary, developmental, historical, communicative commerce take us in the techno-biopolitics of difference?" So basically, in the paper, we take the project of roboticist Steve Grand, which is Lucy the robot orangutan, as a kind of case to which we read through Haraway's Primate Visions to basically make an argument about the imaginative limits of the wider project of making robot human lookalikes and how it might be otherwise, how else we might be figured in relation. And so then let me return to my starting image to take us back away from this, this more specific project of humanoid machines back to the broader frame of the interface at which we come together with particularly digital or computational devices. So here is an image from a study of Andrea that I engaged in, as you can see, many, many years ago, back in the late 1990s. Andrea is a civil engineer. She was working on a project with the California Department of Transportation. We were in a complicated project with them around documents and various other things, but we were interested in their work practices and the technologies that they used, and we spent one session sitting with Andrea at her computer-aided design workstation as she kind of talked us through a problem that she was working on at the moment. And so what she's doing at this particular moment in the videotape is she's talking to us about the intersection that she's working on designing. The project was to, there was a new bridge being built across the Carquinez Straits in the San Francisco Bay Area, but the work of the civil engineers was specifically about the connections of the bridge to the land on each side of the strait, which is actually where things get really complicated. That's where the bridge comes down into communities on top of built environments that include toxic landfill and various other things. And so Andrea was working on trying to design this exchange, this part of the highway around the complexities of that place. One of the things that we found really interesting and that I wrote about in a paper called Embodied Practices of Engineering is that on the one hand, Andrea's knowledge of this, of the object that's rendered here was informed by many, many different relations that she had to this place. So she'd been out there, she'd tromped around underneath the bridge where this interchange was going to be built. She'd been part of many, many community meetings talking about the complications of it. She'd been part of many meetings within Caltrans talking about this interchange. She read many, many other kinds of documents about it, and all of those things were in play as she was engaging with this particular rendering of it. But at the same time, this particular rendering of it made it possible for her to do things that she couldn't do through any of those other ways of knowing it. And so I tried to write about the multiplicity and diversity of her knowledges and the particular kinds of agencies that this technology afforded her. And I like looking at this image alongside this quote from Vivian Sobchak from a very wonderful paper of hers in a book that's titled Carnal Knowledges. I don't have the whole title here, I see. So she says, each technology not only differently mediates our figurations of bodily existence, but also constitutes them. That is, each offers our lived bodies radically different ways of being in the world. Each differently and objectively alters our subjectivity, while each invites our complicity in formulating space, time, and bodily investment. I didn't find this quote, of course, till many years after I wrote about Andrea, but it really, for me, makes a strong connection. It also makes a very strong connection to the work of Natasha Myers, which some of you may know. Natasha has been looking at the forms of embodied knowing that occur as molecular biologists incorporate, and she means this quite literally, their understanding of protein structures through their engagement with both physical and virtual models. And she argues that interactive molecular graphics technologies afford the crystallographers who she's studying the experience of handling and manipulating otherwise intangible protein structures. And at the same time, she argues that the process of learning those structures involves not simply mentation, but a kind of reconfiguration of the scientist's body. So the scientist is engaging with these structures and is in turn transformed through that engagement. And so she writes about this, quote, protein modelers can be understood to dilate, this is a term that she takes from Merleau-Ponty, to dilate and extend their bodies into the prosthetic technologies offered by computer graphics, and to interiorize the products of their bodywork as embodied models of molecular structure. Another I think, really compelling example of this kind of fluidity of body boundaries is provided by the work of Rachel Prentis, who's been looking at minimally invasive robotically assisted surgery. So this is an image which I just pulled off the web of the Da Vinci robot. Interestingly, if any of you have been following us, there have been huge controversies around this robot, which are a whole other interesting set of developments that I won't go into. But what I love about Rachel's work is that she, in interviewing surgeons who have engaged in different kinds of surgery, from the traditional form of surgery, where you literally open up the patient's body so that you can get your hands and hand-sized instruments inside the body, to these robotically mediated surgeries where, as you can see, you have that's the surgeon sitting over on the left looking into this console where there are also controls. The body of the patient is basically across the room, attended to by a whole collection of other people, and the object of a lot of robotic hands. So on the one hand, it would seem that there's been this separation between the body of the surgeon and the body of the patient. There's a kind of distancing that's an effect of these reconfigurations. But on the other hand, surgeons who are experienced in minimally invasive surgery, in doing surgery through these technological mediations, actually report that experientially they find themselves more intimately engaged with the patient's body. So Rachel talks to an orthopedic surgeon who works on shoulders, who talks about how he kind of imagines himself inside the shoulder of the patient, kind of working away at it. So her work beautifully complicates any simple ideas about distance and proximity in relation to technological mediation, and shows that we have to think about those in more complex ways. A less therapeutic and more violent form of body-machine reconfigurations is evident in Natasha Jules' really fascinating work of the interconnected circuitry of the gaming industry, the gambling industry, as it's embodied by digital gambling machine developers. And she looks at the ways in which the industry of developing these technologies comes together with the machines and the gamblers in Las Vegas. So as in molecular modeling, as Natasha Jules has explored it, the physical and digital worlds are joined together to affect the resulting agencies. And in this case, this is in the form of input devices and machine feedback that minimize the motion required of players. So they're continually trying to invent input devices that will require less and less action on the part of the user, that can enable faster and faster rounds of betting, basically. Ergonomically designed chairs that maintain the circulation of the blood and the body's correspondent comforts, so you could sit for hours and hours and not even realize that you've been sitting. And computationally enabled operating systems that expand and more tightly manage the gaming possibilities. So software that increasingly is in a kind of cybernetic feedback loop with the actions of the player, adjusting itself to the tempo of the play, and again, incorporating the player into a closer and closer, faster and faster dynamics of betting. So there's a kind of very unfortunate collusion here in the interests of the developers, of course, who want people to keep playing and to play as rapidly as possible, and players who, as they describe it to Natasha, are looking for, as she says, quote, a dissociated subjective state that the gamblers call the zone, in which conventional spatial, bodily, monetary, and temporal parameters are suspended. So that is the goal. And the boundary of the player and the machine kind of dissolve into this new and very compelling union. That's really what people are after. And the point, as compulsive gamblers explain to her, is not to win, but to keep playing. It's that you want to stay in that place. So the theme of violence then takes us to to my current work on the emergent interfaces of remotely controlled warfighting, in which particularly my country of citizenship, the United States, has taken the lead. Though you might note Kinetic here, which is a company that's based in the UK, as I point out to my UK audiences. So this is an image of one such interface, and it's taken from an article in the New York Times in November of 2010 that was titled "War Machines Recruiting Robots for Combat." And I've been following these developments, but what really struck me in this image was the caption that goes along with the image, and particularly by its closing phrase, and I'll read it to you because I realize it's very small here. It says, quote, "Remotely controlled, some armed robots are operated with video game-style consoles, helping to keep humans away from danger." So it's the implied universality of the category human here, who could not want to keep humans away from danger, and the self-evidence of whatever that danger might be, along with the associated dehumanization or erasure of those who would, of course, be the targets of these devices. That is my provocation, my starting place in the research. So remotely controlled killing is currently being pursued through the expansion of an institution that political theorist and US military chronicle James Derderian has named the Military Industrial Media Entertainment Network. This is an infrastructure that he argues enables the premise of what he calls virtuous war, and here's what he says about that. At the heart of virtuous war is the technical capability and ethical imperative to threaten and, if necessary, actualize violence from a distance with no or minimal casualties, that is, to our side, of course. Fought in the same manner as they're represented by real-time surveillance and TV live feeds, virtuous wars promote a vision of bloodless, humanitarian, hygienic wars. Virtuality collapses distance between here and there, near and far, fact and fiction. It widens the distance between those who have and have not. So this idea of the asymmetry that goes along with virtuous war, as a number of commentators have pointed out, this widening of the distance between those who have and have not might help us to understand the suicide bomber as, among many other things, a kind of desperate response to these developments. So in the absence of this high-tech weaponry for remotely controlled killing, what's available is the ability literally to put your body in proximity with others, to become yourself a weapon. And I would refer you to Derek Gregory, who's a geographer, cultural geographer at UBC, has a fantastic website titled Geographical Imaginations. In this particular post, he talks about this relationship between the suicide bomber and these developments in remote control as the kind of, in a way, a kind of responsive imaging of each other. Judith Butler has countered the premise of virtuous war perhaps more clearly and definitively than anyone, including in her book Frames of War, published in 2010. Butler challenges the historical precedent and more fundamentally the premise of a legal framework regarding warfare. And she writes, "The international law that prohibits crimes against civilians presupposes that there can be a war without such crimes, reproducing the idea of a clean war whose destruction has perfect aim. But if there is no stable way to distinguish permissible collateral damage from the destruction of civilian life, then such crimes are inevitable. There is no non-criminal war." So she is, I think, more radically than anyone challenging the ideas of precision that inform current warfighting in the United States. As you probably have followed in the news, there's a fascination with these configurations of remotely controlled killing in the case of drones, where we have operators who are sitting at Creech Air Force Base in Nevada and flying drones over Afghanistan and Pakistan. There are, again, I think, a lot of interesting questions that I don't have time to go into here about questions of distance and proximity in this configuration as well. And Derek Gregory also has a really fantastic analysis of the difference between the kind of close-up view that pilots report that they have. There's always the comparison with the B-52 flying, dropping bombs with no visual awareness, and the drone pilot who has, their varying reports, but much closer view of what's going on. Gregory points out that rather than thinking about that view as an intimate one, we could think about it as the view of the voyeur, or I would say the stalker. So it's a very particular sense of intimacy, but again, there's a whole interesting set of issues there. But Obama's war, as these operations have come to be called, is legitimated on the premise of precision in the identification of its targets. That is absolutely crucial. So here's a quote from Assistant to the President for Homeland Security and Counterterrorism, John Brennan. So he asserts, with the unprecedented ability of remotely piloted aircraft to precisely target a military objective while minimizing collateral damage, one could argue that never before has there been a weapon that allows us to distinguish more effectively between an Al-Qaeda terrorist and innocent civilians. Well, again, those of you who have been following the developments in this area will be aware that there's an enormous amount of counter-evidence to this claim for the ability to precisely identify that underlies the claims for legitimacy of the targeted killing program. So we have examples like this. Rafiq Rahman, who is a primary teacher in the so-called federally administered tribal areas this is in northwest Waziristan in Pakistan, who recently testified with two of his children in a hearing at the US Congress regarding the drone strike a year before that had killed his 67-year-old mother as she was picking okra in a field with her grandchildren nearby. A really powerful commentary, and United Nations Special Rapporteur on Counterterrorism, Ben Emerson, recently estimated in a report to the UN Human Rights Council that, quote, at least 400 civilians have been killed in Pakistan as a result of remotely piloted aircraft strikes since they began in 2004. And a further 200 individuals were regarded as probable non-combatants. Officials indicated that owing to underreporting and obstacles to effective investigation, it's incredibly difficult to get into these areas, these figures were likely to be an underestimate. The Bureau of Investigative Journalism is continually tracking, doing their best to track the effects of these drone strikes, and they have a great website where you can see that. So all of this counter evidence to the claims for precision again bring into question this premise that somehow the view from the drone is one that enables a very definite identification. We have these claims of precision on the one hand, and we have mounting evidence of the profound uncertainties of identification of those who become targets. And Derek Gregory talks about what he calls the skopic regimes of the unmanned aerial vehicle, and his central thesis is that the lines of sight that are afforded through these regimes are inescapably tethered, as he says, to the view from our side, while they systematically erase the standpoints of those who aren't identified with the US military or its allies. So he says, quote, high-resolution imagery is not a uniquely technical capacity, but part of a technocultural system that renders our space familiar, even in their space, which remains obdurately other. So I think this is tremendously important because he's reminding us that vision is not a strictly technical matter. It's a matter that's deeply informed by the positionality of the gaze that's engaged in that vision. And his argument is that the positionality of that gaze makes it impossible to engage in the kinds of recognition that underlie the claims of the current programs. Okay, so to close, I'm going to just say a bit about what is my current research site in this project. It's represented here in an image from December of 2001, but to get to the image, I'm going to fast forward a decade or so. So it's Monday, the 2nd of April of 2012, and I'm sitting at a Pete's coffee shop in Marina del Rey, California, talking to Gerald Pear, who's the former lead designer for Flatworld, a flagship project from 2001 to 2008 for the University of Southern California's Institute for Creative Technologies, or ICT. In the book Virtuous War, Derderian identifies the ICT's opening in 1999 as a founding moment in the emergence of the military-industrial media entertainment network. Explicitly committed to strengthening the synergies of the entertainment and defense industries, the Army allocated $45 million for the first 5 years to the University of Southern California to create a research laboratory dedicated to the development of advanced simulations. As described by Tim Lenoir and Henry Lowood in their 2000 paper, Theaters of War, the Military Entertainment Complex, quote, at the opening ceremonies of the ICT, Richard Lindheim, the executive director, outlined several projects the Institute would be pursuing. Among those he described was the construction of what he referred to as the holodeck. The idea, Lindheim explained, is to leverage new media technologies of virtual reality to link immersive virtual environments with interactive synthetic agents that are elements of simulation and game-based learning exercises, end quote. So as a first instantiation of this vision of the holodeck, this single-room flat world prototype was demonstrated in November of 2001 in a warehouse space near the ICT in Marina del Rey, with physical walls and props that were created by collaborators from Paramount Studios. The goal of the project was to create virtual environments that are, in the words of the designers, quote, indistinguishable from their real-world counterparts. So over the ensuing 7 years, the project created these large digital flats. So it's flats in the theatrical sense, running real-time computer graphics augmented by physical props that act as portals into the virtual world. So you have a physical door that leads out onto a virtual city square, along with sensory effects that are cued to relevant virtual objects or ambient environments. So you have tactile floor speakers that simulate the flashes and vibrations of explosions. So they've built in a lot of, they've made a lot of efforts to incorporate what they call mixed reality in these projects, combining physical and digital technologies. So back in this coffee shop down the road from the ICT in 2012, Gerald Pear and I have spent the last hour discussing the life of the project over the 7 years of its existence. And where would the archive of the project be now, I ask. Well, I suppose I have most of it, he replies, and then generously offers to make it available to me. So 4 months later, he sends me links to 3 gigabytes of material that he's painstakingly drawn together. It is over 1,000 files, tracing the Flat World project from its precursors to its last implementations. And so it's this very fortuitous archive that comprises, in a sense, my current field site. And I've been working more specifically with a guided tour of Flat World as it was configured in 2005. I'm going to be showing that video in the workshop tomorrow and inviting you all to help me think about it. But for now, I'll just say a few things about it and give you a sense for my initial efforts towards an analysis. So the tour itself opens as an explicitly filmic event. We see Gerald, his hand on the door leading into the Flat World simulation. He's talking to the camera. He asks filming, and then we hear the canonical cinematic command action. But before the door even opens, we hear sounds that seem to come from somewhere else than the studio space in which Gerald and the cameramen are standing. We hear a combination of Islamic calls to prayer, gunfire in the distance. And Gerald explains that his walkthrough is not itself, as he says, a story-based demo. but rather it's aimed at demonstrating the technical capacities of the system, with the viewer invited to extrapolate its possible uses in operational settings. But as becomes clear, the technical system that the demo reveals is saturated in stories, and it's those that I'm particularly interested in. In my first watching of the video, I was disconcerted by the ways in which Gerald seemed to distance himself from what I found to be its very disturbing content. Helicopters and UAVs flying overhead, explosions, figures of bad guys, the bad guy being a stereotypically keffiyeh scarf-wrapped terrorist with an automatic weapon who Gerald dispatches using his PC tablet and replaces with this good guy who's, of course, a fully kitted out, very clean-cut U.S. infantryman who we're to understand was responsible for saving us from the bad guy. There's a small boy who hails us. He says, "Hey, U.S. over here," and then he throws rocks at us. There's a Humvee parked behind the house that provides the escape vehicle in which we imagine ourselves being taken out of harm's way. And so I wonder how, in demonstrating this technology, which he's been so intimately involved in designing, could he be so immune to its figurations? The philosopher Helen Varenne has suggested that rather than something to be resolved and dispelled, disconcertment can be a sign of trouble with which we need to stay. And so in the larger project of which this engagement with flatworld is part, I want to focus on the military concept of situational awareness, and more specifically, the requirements of positive identification and of imminent threat that underwrite the canons of legal killing. And I'm thinking about this trope of situational awareness through related questions of intelligibility and identification, specifically as they're taken up by Judith Butler. So in Bodies That Matter, Butler suggests that the intelligibility of the body includes always what she calls its constitutive outsides, those unthinkable and unlivable bodies that, in her words, do not matter in the same way. So bodies that do not matter in the same way takes on an additional resonance in the context of simulation, in the sense of bodies differently materialized. So flatworld's distinction between us who are actual and them who are virtual plays as another layer of intelligibility and identification, which works in a very complex dynamic with other readings of us and them that are so central to the operations of war. Looking at flatworld, we can begin to see how our bodies immersed in virtual environments are transformed by them, while their virtual bodies are also reiterative and generative of actual ones. That's the premise and the promise of simulation. These simulations are infused with a second reading of us and them as well, of course, figures of us who are Americans differentiated from them who are other. And that difference leads to the third, between friend and enemy. So what is the relation between the virtual figure of the enemy and the enemy? Situational awareness rests on a premise of recognition of that which is already there, already a threat or not one. But if we think of the enemy in the way that Butler first urged us to think of sex, both need to be understood as part of regulatory practices that produce the bodies that those same practices are designed to govern. On this analysis, like sex, the enemy is, in Butler's words, quote, an ideal construct which is forcibly materialized through reiteration. And as Butler observes, that this reiteration is necessary is a sign that materialization is never quite fixed, that bodies never quite comply with the norms by which their materialization is compelled. And it's those constitutive instabilities in her theoretical framing that afford the possibilities for transformative refiguration. So as with sex after Butler, in other words, it should be impossible to think of the enemy in any other way than performatively, as the effect of a regulatory ideal and an essential constituent of what we can call the military imperative. For the soldier, the enemy is not simply out there, but one of the categories by which the soldier becomes viable, that which qualifies him or her within the domain of cultural intelligibility that comprises the military. So if the construction of the enemy is not a singular or determining act, but rather a process of reiteration, how might we reconceive training from training the body in recognition and response, which is the current conception of situational awareness, to training as itself productive of the entities to be recognized. Seen as another mode of reiteration, simulation is then deeply implicated in performing the realities that it cites. So I close with a question which sets up my research agenda. How can we think simulation and actuality together through their resemblances, their real corporeal connections, and articulate their crucial differences, particularly when it comes to acts of wounding and killing? What does it mean that remote control is becoming the primary operating configuration for US military operations? How do we, like Gerald, maintain our distance from the scene of battle? What does it mean to be at once immersed in a world, but at the same time not of it? And what are the leaky boundaries that undo the carefully crafted lines of connection and separation meant to keep our bodies safe and to maintain the difference between those of us who are addressed by the simulation and those figured as its objects? These are pressing questions not only for those involved in command and control of the front lines, but also for those of us responsible as citizens for grasping events in which we are, at however great a distance, politically, economically, and morally implicated. Thanks.
While in the socio-philosophical realm, the mind-body duality has already been under heavy deconstruction. Meanwhile, in the positivist realm, in engineering and science, the hardware-software dichotomy remains rigid. And as we have this mutual infiltration of the soft body on the one hand and the hard bodies on the other, how do you foresee legal and moral responsibilities can at all be assigned
for
when a software hardware complex infiltrates, constrains, informs, and enables certain behaviors in the soft body?
Yeah. Okay, it's a great question. I mean, I think of it in terms of, what are the implications of these ways of thinking about agencies? If we take seriously the idea that agencies are an effect of particular configurations, then what does that mean for responsibility, right? And I think for me, it's a matter of what is our unit of analysis. So it becomes much more complicated than the idea that the human is always responsible because they program the machine. That's the sort of simplistic answer to that. Because of course the human now is inseparable from its entanglements with the machine. And so that's, in a way, for me, why the configuration of remote control is distressing and needs to be addressed as a configuration. Now, I mean, there are a lot of things to be said about how, in the military case, the military has in fact thought long and hard about chains of command, about being able to trace lines of accountability and so forth. And there are discussions now in terms of developments in increased automation and autonomous weapons. How will responsibility be assigned? I think we have to think about these things together. We have to think about what are the implications of making a particular arrangement, of making is too simple a word, but what are the implications of the emergence of particular arrangements with very particular vested interests that are animating those developments. And I think we have to address it in that way, in those relations, and their consequences.
Going back to the beginning of your talk when you were discussing this concept of entanglement, do you see a gender-based difference in how women look at the concepts of entanglement? And I guess what I'm trying to unpack is there any hope that possibly the Jungians were right and that the sort of mythopoeic concept that women have a totally different, I guess you might call it risk analysis of entanglement, and therefore might react to things like the remote vision, the Google Earth vision that we've now got as a reality, and the robots, flying drones, and Does it speak to something intrinsically different inside the female psyche?
No.
No.
I mean, I say that so unequivocally because, I'm completely anti-essentialist as far as this goes. I'm totally interested in problematizing the categories of men and women, of working against the idea that there's somehow innate differences that underwrite those two categories. However, with that said, there is no question that these things are gendered, that we ourselves grow up in historically constituted gendered relations that have implications for our engagements in relationality or not. So I think there is no question that part of what's going on here is about certain kinds of technophilia, and the ways that those are gendered. Maybe certainly feminist theory, I think, is inspired by a desire to kind of reconceptualize the foundations of entities and relations. But I don't think it's, I wouldn't characterize it in that way. I think it's more complicated.
Of all the different examples you made of the interactions of the technology and the constitutive of humans and technologies, sort of those different interactions. So the boundaries leak or don't leak according to different vectorializations of affect. So you have sort of the humanization of the robot at the beginning. Of course, it's an affect of identification, whereas at the end, with the question of war, what's being put in place, it's a machine or the simulation that installs distancing that's different from the kind of midway distancing that happens in the surgery room, where at stake is the affect. You have to save the patient, you have to save a life. In the war framing, you're bound to, so I'm kind of curious about sort of how the human technology sort of interface is actually modulated by affective politics.
Yeah. Well, I think you characterized it as a leitmotif. I really appreciate that because I think you're right. I'm constantly kind of touching on that, but not fully engaging with it, and it's absolutely central. And I think I think there's something very powerful going on in terms of in the case of remote control, about lines of identification and affiliation and the affective politics of those. So the military, in my very limited understanding, works very, very hard and very successfully to create extraordinary affective bonds among comrades, basically. That is the most overriding and important commitment, is to the lives of your comrades. And the testimony of drone operators, because they are in these complex networks of communication that include troops on the ground. And there's there's a paper that I circulated as part of the workshop which recounts an incident in Afghanistan of civilian death, which was all about the orientation of the operators to a special forces unit that was in the neighborhood of the civilians who were mistaken for Taliban. But that kind of, they're almost palpable, those kinds of affective lines of affiliation and of dissociation. And I think that's absolutely integral and, and is missing in the, again, I kind of touch on it, but it's really deserving of much more dedicated kind of analysis.
I'm wondering if you can speak a little bit about how theory connects to activism and in particular your work with the International Committee for Robot Arms Control.
Oh yes, well thank you for giving iCrack a plug here. Yes, well, I a couple of years ago joined an organization called the International Committee for Robot Arms Control, which is a combination of roboticists, international human rights lawyers, arms control people. And I would say that's one aspect of my activism. The focus of ICRAC at the moment is very much on initiating an arms control regime around autonomous robotic weapons. So these are weapons that would be programmed to automatically identify targets and initiate lethal force. Really, really, really bad idea. For all sorts of reasons. And it's a crucial moment because these weapons are, the United States Defense Department is saying, oh, there's always going to be a human in or on, supervising these. So they're backpedaling away from the idea that they would actually deploy such weapons. But at the same time, there's clearly research and development going on in that direction. So the argument of ICRAC is this is a moment where there is the possibility of actually drawing a line and saying this is not acceptable. They've had some significant success in the Convention on Conventional Weapons, which is the body that adjudicates landmines, chemical weapons, other kinds of weapons around which some combination of treaties and international consensus might form up about the unacceptability of certain kinds of weapons. So I think that's a crucial campaign, and I really support it. And also, I don't think the human in the loop is the solution. So I kind of want to, I'm as concerned, if not more at the moment, about the United States targeted killing program as I am about that arms control effort. I think they're both crucial. But I was just part of a Google Hangout webcast this morning where we really interestingly came across this kind of tension because there were people who were, it was basically framed around autonomous weapons, but we had a couple of participants, one a former parliamentarian from Pakistan, a youth activist from Islamabad, who said, yes, this is a bad thing, we need arms control around it, but right now, with the existing weapon systems, people are getting killed, and we need to do something about that. So I'm very engaged in activism around both of those things, both working to insist on the illegality of the current targeted killing program, and also take this opportunity to maybe forestall, the kind of next logical step in these developments.
It strikes me that the situational awareness trope is just so strikingly impoverished with respect to the notion of the conception of situation. For me, so in addition to all the other issues with the gamification, I think there's so many problematic assumptions about information, cognition, and perception that are built into this notion of situation, and specifically the notion of remote sensing of a situation. And so, like a simple example, I presume that when the drone is flying over, allowing the hunters to choose their target, the temperature isn't adjusted in their room to match the temperature where the drone is. For example, many aspects of understanding the behavior of what you're observing have to do with an awareness of the context and the environment in which that behavior is taking place. Something as simple as doing this might be misinterpreted depending on whether you think it's hot or cold outside. It doesn't stop. One response of a designer of the system might be, well, we just need to transmit more information back. They need to know the temperature. But it doesn't stop. It's impossible to draw a line between the types of quote information that you can transfer and where the situation begins and ends. So maybe there was a funeral today across the city, and people are upset and sad. That aspect of the situation may or may not be transferable, but it goes on and on. It reminds me of Dreyfus's famous arguments against microworlds, that there's nowhere to draw a boundary. And so I think that I wonder if the framing of this as materialization that you're taking from Judith Butler is the right framing, in the sense that so many aspects of a situation cannot be and should not be materialized or embodied, or any other sort of framing that you might want to put into the remote sensing sort of paradigm or framing of it. So to me, it seems like by going down the path of materialization, you give away too much to the people who are wanting to design such systems. That, well, we'll just add more better things to give them more situational awareness, when their conception of situation sort of is the problem itself.
Right. Well, I think it depends on what we understand by materialization. So, and remember that the particular materialization that Butler is interested in is of categories, is of identifications of particular kinds, male or female. I'm friends and enemies, right? So, and categories are one way of coping, of course, with the problems of intelligibility, right? So, and one of the big concerns I think about situational awareness, I mean, and the latest Snowden revelations in the NSA are, again, a great example of this, is that that in the absence of an ongoing deep connection and knowledge of the situations in which you're operating, and in the presence of huge volumes of information, what do you resort to? You resort to categories. You resort to profiling, stereotyping, and we already see that happening. We have suspected militants. We have Islamic extremists. So I think it's the materialization of those categories in particular that's really problematic. And the situational awareness is a long-standing problem for the military. I mean, it is an acknowledged, this is one of the big, it's the fog of war. How do you know what's going on around you? And so it's an unresolved problem. But I think in the best case, good intelligence is about people with on-the-ground, long-standing relations to place, to others, and there are a lot of critiques of the shift towards data mining and other modes of of information gathering, and away from on the ground long-term sort of understanding that are part of this the problem with these developments, I think.
When you mentioned military and entertainment, I'm not sure if you mentioned games. What came to mind was Ender's Game, and I'm boycotting the film, but I love the book. And how I'm curious how gaming and warfare are becoming more and more similar, which is the premise of Ender's Game.
Yeah.
And so I don't want to simplify it as saying, video games train killers. However, I'm wondering if we have generations now that have now grown up with militaristic gaming and these drone warfare, which are, the interfaces are seeming increasingly blurred, and if that's something that's, I'm just wondering how
Absolutely.
that might affect.
No, this is a really interesting area. I recommend a book called Gameplay Mode by Patrick Krogan, which is a history of gaming and simulation in the military, and up into the present. Really, really fabulous book. So those relations are tremendously important. Gaming and simulation have a long history in the military, but now, they're pervasive in ways that they haven't been before. They're being very actively and directly used by the military for recruiting and for training. And so, I agree. We don't have to simplistically say, these guys are all video gamers, but there's some very important relationship between what's going on in terms of immersive virtual environments and experiencing those environments, and this very deliberate kind of conjoining of the military and the entertainment industries. And I have been collaborating with a colleague at the University of Bochum in Germany, Estrid Sorensen, who works on video games and violence. And she's really interested in trying to refine the idea that, video games engender violent behavior, but to understand, what are the real material consequences of very, very extensive engagement with video games. And we're working on a workshop at the moment, which she's given the wonderful title of Safe War, to try to think about the relations between violent video games, technology-mediated, remotely controlled weapon systems. Yeah, how can we, and this is, it's really tied to my question here, and actually Dorte Marie Sondergaard, this paper of hers, she also looks at kids and games, and this question of how can we get at the ways in which it really does matter, those games matter, but not through a simple kind of causal, either they do or they don't lead to. It's much more.
When you mentioned distancing and othering, and I'm wondering if when people have come in to the military, they've already had years of distancing and othering through various media.
Of course, exactly. And that's the other thing, is what are the continuities between long-standing forms of being trained up and, and contemporary environments, technologically mediated environments.
Does the organization that you're involved with that is combating what I would call unpeaceful uses of lower space, are they at all interested in things like Amazon announcing they're going to deliver parcels with drones? Because, that was a wonderful image of the lady sitting in the chair at Las Vegas. I mean, if you combine data analytics and the fact they know I love cheesies, I'm going to have a drone floating by that's going to sell me cheesies. It's not going to leave me alone, just like the ads won't leave you alone on your interface. So how do you start fighting that? Or are you busy with bigger matters? I don't mean to trivialize the other problems.
No, I mean, it's interesting because I, just in the way that we do to try to make things manageable, when I'm following developments in relation to drones, I've been making this distinction between drones in domestic spaces and drones as weapons, as military systems, and it makes sense to make that division for certain purposes, but also we can see these things are getting more and more entangled with each other. So the ways that surveillance cuts across, policing and military operations, the ways in which data mining cuts across marketing and other kinds of targeting for persons of interest and so forth. So I mean, I think there's the practical issue of how is what's one going to follow in your own research and your own activism, but there's also, I think, increasing interrelation. And the whole, the development of the kind of domestic drone use, I think, is very interesting in terms of its kind of regulation and governance. I'm kind of counting on in the U.S. at least, there's the Federal Aviation Administration, that's very sensitive about having things flying around that might interfere with commercial aircraft and so forth. But again, I haven't been following that closely, but it's just there are DIY drones. I mean, there's going to be an incredible proliferation of many varieties of these technologies, and it I don't know exactly what to do. I totally agree with you that it amplifies all of the issues around market harassment and profiling and data mining and that kind of thing.
Thank you very much.
You're very welcome.
Excellent talk.